So as part of the sign-in process, we also want to store the user's details. You don't have to do this, like I said, but it is worthwhile doing. And what we're going to be doing here is just taking a little bit of a shortcut to doing this. We're just going to be issuing an insert statement, but you might want to do things like check if the user already exists first. In my case, I'm just going to insert a record, and we're going to assume the Twitter ID is the unique field, and that's then going to not overwrite the user's details if they sign in again. So we're going to be basically issuing an insert statement every time the user authenticates. So we want to call this store user. Now with this, we want to send through a payload, and that comes from the reply from Twitter's API, which contains things like our screen name and our user ID, both of which we're going to be storing. So let's create this method down here, store user, and that's going to take in a payload, and we're going to issue a query just in here. So let's build up our database first of all. So let's bring our terminal back up, and we'll sign in to our MySQL terminal or monitor. And let's use the website database I already have set up. You can go ahead and create your own database. And we want to just have a show of tables. There's nothing in here. So let's create a table called users. And we're going to have an ID. We're also going to have a Twitter ID. And we're going to have a Twitter username. Okay, so for the ID, this is just going to be an integer. It's going to be unsigned. It's going to be a primary key, and it's going to be auto incrementing. So just like a normal ID that you'd get. Now for the Twitter ID, this is going to be a big int. It's going to be unsigned. It's also going to be unique, which is really important. You need this field if you're doing it the way that I'm doing it. And that's it, I believe. So for the Twitter username, this can just be a varchar. And I think, yeah, the Twitter username limit is 20, so we can store this as 20. So let's just describe that users table just to make sure we've got everything right. So we've got an ID here, which will auto increment as the primary key, an unsigned Twitter ID, which is unique, and a Twitter username. Perfect. So inside of our store user, we need to call a query. Now what I'm going to do is I'm building this in a way that I'd assume you're going to have your own way of connecting to your database, but what we're going to actually do is inside of classes build up this DB class in here, just literally so you can inject your own way of connecting and querying into this Twitter auth class. So for this database class, it's going to be extremely easy. I'm just going to use MySQLi. Probably might be better to use PDO if you want this to be easily expandable. Nothing wrong with MySQLi though. So let's create a MySQLi instance here, or a property to hold this instance. And let's create a construct here. This class is going to be really small. We're just going to say this MySQLi is a new instance of MySQLi. We're going to connect to our local host. We are going to connect with the username root, the password root, and we're going to choose website as the database. So we also need another method here, which is going to be query. All this is going to do is just return this MySQLi query, and obviously we need a SQL argument passed in here, and we'll just pass that to that. That's all we need to do for this. So you can either copy this if you don't have a database solution. You can add other methods in here if you need, but we can close that now. We know that that should work. So what we're going to do inside of our init.php file is we're going to create a new instance of our DB. So we're going to say DB is new DB. That's it. And we need to inject this anytime we call Twitter auth. So Twitter auth can make use of it. So in the index file, we will also put it in the sign out file. In actual fact, no, we won't. Yeah, we will, just for simplicity. You can make these optional, but we'll ignore that for now. And also in the callback as well, like this. So you can chop and change this depending on how efficient you want to be. But what we're going to do now is we're going to create a method up here called DB. We're also going to now allow a DB to be passed in, and we can type hint that to DB, so that must have a DB object passed in, and then all we do is we say this DB is DB. That's it. So now we have access to the functionality inside of this DB class, so i.e. we can just query. So in here we can say this DB query. Cool, so inside of here, let's now insert a new record, and that's into the users table. And the values here are going to be the Twitter ID, or the user ID, and the screen name, or the Twitter username, as we've called it in here. So inside of, if we just look here, remember that we're using this reply, we're passing this through to store user. So we've now got access to things like reply user ID, and we've also got access to reply, or this should be payload, screen name. So in my case, the user ID will be like the number that we saw earlier, and that happens to match my creator ID for my app, and the screen name will happen to match the owner because I'm using the same account to authenticate. So we can use these inside of our query. So we want to insert into users Twitter ID and Twitter username. So the values here for the Twitter ID, it's payload user ID, as we've already seen, and then in single quotes it's going to be the Twitter username, and that is screen name. Bear in mind, I'm sure this may not be an issue, but bear in mind I'm not escaping anything here. Do be wary. Anything that is passed into your queries, go ahead and escape. I'm not going to bother with it here, but please make sure you do it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say on duplicate key, and basically what this means is if this unique field here, remember this is set to unique, if this new unique field is provided again, we want to basically do an update on ID equals ID, and this will just basically maintain this record. It won't insert a new record, it will just update ID to equal ID, which basically does nothing. So let's check that this all works. Let's go over to here and sign out, and we'll also open up our database. Obviously, I select everything from users at the moment, has no results, but when we sign in with Twitter, hopefully everything's sort of working. We're signed in now. So let's just check this query. Okay. This should be duplicate spelled correctly. Okay, so now let's give this another try. Let's sign in with Twitter again. Oh, yeah, we get a sign in failed. That was on for too long. Sign in with Twitter. There we go. So we're now signed in. If we head over and check this, it's now been stored. So with the unique field, if we were to sign in again with the same account, that just redirects us back. That won't store another record because we have this as a unique field. So that's it. We've stored a user. We've obviously signed in and authenticated with Twitter. Again, storing the user's information is optional. You may want to store other information along with this user in case you want to save it. And that's it.